Well, thank you for all being here. I just wanted to say that it's a great pleasure to see so many new or relatively new faces in the room, as well as old friends and comrades. So this is a sort of unusual talk. I'm not going to try to convince you of anything so much as to tell you about work in progress, two projects in particular that are on the way to being completed. I thought I might begin, however, with this. It is a best practice in scholarship to begin with a summary of opposing views. A new place in Stratford was purchased by William Shakespeare in 1597. And this, famous Shakespeare scholars like James Shapiro assures us, is evidence for the Stratford man's upward mobility and theatrical success. What you're looking at here is an electronic version of a lithograph from the 1907 11th impression of James Orchard Halliwell Phillips' outlines of the life of Shakespeare. And this is what Halliwell Phillips says about it. The remains of New Place, a partial sketch of which is engraved on the opposite leaf, that's what we're looking at, are typical of the fragments of personal history of Shakespeare, which have hitherto been discovered. And there I've given you a photo of Halliwell Phillips thumbing his nose at somebody, I'm not sure exactly who. So fortunately, much progress has been made in the brisk business of Shakespeare biographies. Fictional lives of Shakespeare have never sold better than in the 21st century. And that must be at least partly on account of the scholarly industry applied in replastering the foundations of New Place. And notwithstanding Kevin Gilvari's hint in his 2018 Routledge volume, The Fictional Lives of Shakespeare. So to draw a little nearer to my real objective in this talk, as he so often has done, Michael, that is Professor de la Hoyd, puts his finger on an important dimension of the Oxfordian and post-Stratfordian inquiries. One of the glories of Oxfordian scholarship is that because its expansive view of Shakespeare is multidisciplinary and limitless in intellectual inclusiveness, we all have room for the infinite variety of our assorted areas of expertise, unlike the jockeying for fiefdom supremacy within most academic fields, especially orthodox Shakespearean studies. Now, the contrast that de la Hoyd is making here is, I believe, a consequential one. For decades, the Stratfordians have circled their own wagons closer and closer, chopped their subject matter up into competitive territories, and generally flaunted the principles of and practices of good scholarship. But these things, I would argue, are neither a role model nor a fair representation of academia at large. And when Oxfordians fall into the belief that they are, then we are being, in de la Hoyd's terms, blind to our own error. Of course, it is fashionable in some circles to regard peer review as intrinsically corrupt and inevitably self-serving. And trust me, I have seen more than a lifetime's worth of hostile, moronic peer reviews issued by prejudicial readers and rubber stamped by editors. But I've also seen how peer review has challenged me as a writer, caught mistakes for me, and opened new avenues of inquiry by guiding a work to achieve its best destined form. Without standards of review, without consultation with experts, without reviewing even the Stratfordian commentary on our subject, we will fail to achieve our objectives and leave ourselves prey to the very same reputation that Stratfordians have justly gained by confusing their role in the education industry with refabricating a 16th century replica house on the foundations of New Place to attract tourist dollars. We also miss out on an opportunity to score points by recontextualizing their statements. Those like Halliwell Phillips, who are perpetuating their own glass house ignorance. Our arguments will be no more persuasive or conclusive than those maintained over many decades by Stratfordians who believed that they could prove the occupation of the owner of New Place using a controlled database of the 6 Shakespeare signatures that their heroic penman wrote in the 1616 will or Hand D of the Sir Thomas More manuscript. We need standards. And standards require discipline of one form or another. So I'm going to tell you 2 stories about how I grew from an intrigued amateur to someone with publications in 2 quite distinct aspects of our Oxfordian case, one involving handwriting and the other mathematics. That can't be right. I'm terrified of math. So, and the bullet points I think are summarizing what I've just said. Professor Delahoyd has led the way in anticipating what I want to say in his essay, which is in one of the volumes that Earl just mentioned, namely the Shakespeare Authorship Source Book, an essay called On Being Wrong, one of the most entertaining and thought-provoking of many good articles in that book. The problem with Michael's somewhat utopian vision that I just quoted to you is the same one that he has identified in his On Being Wrong essay. To err, of course, is human. But if error is the human condition, then scholarship must find a way to weed out error for the sake of advancement of knowledge as a common good. That, at least, is the methodology I follow for myself. I don't start telling stories about my discoveries until I've weeded out as many errors as possible. To paraphrase Professor Barber, why risk letting a good story be ruined by a string of errors? And as the Danish poet philosopher Piet Hein advises us, our journey should be one of recalibration, to err and err and err again, but less and less and less. And this is also what academic disciplines, notwithstanding their failures, aspire to do. And they often achieve it through self-critical methods. It may not seem that way to us since we are involved in a problem in which English departments and drama programs have dumbed down their own subject over a long period of time and suppressed the critical thinking potentials of not only their students, but themselves. But this is not, in my experience, the academic norm. It is only the norm when a whole industry involving a potent mixture of commercial and self-interests and academic dogma defends a lie over several generations. So the first of the 2 projects that I want to speak to you about is about this book, Palladis Tamia, published in 1598. Now, we've already heard Professor Barber speak about this a little bit. This is the first publication to ever identify Shakespeare as a playwright. So it is indeed a critical piece of evidence in our controversy. And the name Shakespeare, for the first time, appears on 2 play quartos, Richard II and Richard III, within weeks of the appearance of Palladis Tamia. What I'm going to say today is I owe a great debt of influence and insight to the late Robert Dedabell and the late K.C. Legan, who in 2009, in the very first issue of Brief Chronicles, published an article called Francis Mears and the Earl of Oxford. And the work that I have done on this book is I'm standing on their shoulders. Let's put it that way. So what you're looking at here on the top is the title, is the cover, and also a very small version of the first page of the article that I have this fall published in Critical Survey. This article deconstructs and destroys the Stratfordian myth of Francis Mears as a dull copyist who endorses Will Shakespeare as the author. Mears instead, I argue in this article, used a steganographic design, a kind of a code that works by looking at the arrangement of things to carefully encode his real opinion, namely that Shakespeare was a cover name for Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And as I already mentioned, this project for me actually goes back before Dedabel and Ligon's article, but I spent about 20 years pondering this book. And then I read their article, and suddenly the lights went off and I started to get it. But I thought there were things that could be added to their masterful work. And let me just summarize here Elizabeth Winkler's really impressive one-paragraph summary of the issue. Why, in 1598, did Francis Mears publish a book praising both Shakespeare and Oxford as the best for comedy? Did Mears know that Oxford had been using a pseudonym? Was he playing along with the ruse? Waugh and Stritmatter, this is in the Shakespeare Illusion book. The article I'm talking about is an outtake and enlarged version of what is in the Illusion book. They argue that he did know and that he indicated as much. Mears, who believed in heavenly arithmetic or numerical order, doled out his praise in carefully balanced symmetrical lists, comparing 3 Greek poets, for instance, to 3 Latin poets and 3 English poets. In his list for comedy, though, he set 16 classical playwrights against 17 English playwrights. Why is the symmetry off? Balance is restored, Waugh and Stritmatter argue, if you recognize that 2 names on the list of 17 playwrights, Oxford and Shakespeare, represent the same person. So now I want to tell you a little bit about peer review. I gave you a little teaser. This is an outtake from the letter that I received when I submitted this article to a particular journal who will remain anonymous for its own sake. And also an excerpt from the 750-word review, which is quite unusual. Normally, a reviewer will give you maybe 200 words or 300 words to tell you how wrong you were, if that's what they believe. The editor wrote, "Dear Professor Stritmatter, I am sorry to say that this submission does not meet our standards for publication." What was the basis of that conclusion? Well, the reviewer wrote, "This is one of the most irresponsible scholarly articles that I have ever had the opportunity to review. Some evidence of this article is purely concocted. The submission is dangerously and selectively skeptical, throwing out a good deal of scholarly consensus, even on rather outlandish claims." Actually, I did a complete and thorough peer review of the whole history of scholarship going back almost 100 years on Francis Mears. And it was the Orthodox scholars themselves, along with Ligon and Dedabel, that were the most useful in constructing my own argument. The idea that Mears was steeped in numerology and the mystery of numbers is ridiculous. Now, I've put on the same slide, you notice, the book that Francis Mears published in 1597, 1 year before Palladis Tamia. It was called God's Arithmetic. So somehow that didn't register with my reviewer. It is ridiculous that Francis Mears would believe in numerical design or what she calls numerology, particularly given that the only evidence provided for that claim is some numerological hocus pocus created by the author of this essay. The present manuscript bulldozes over obvious evidence to the contrary, not given by the reviewer, mind you. These are all claims that are never backed up by any piece of evidence. To make its point without any nuance, subtlety, or genuine skepticism whatsoever. I told you that I build the case substantially on what Orthodox scholars have said. I really did enjoy writing this essay, perhaps because of what my anonymous and obviously flustered reviewer refers to as its danger to the tradition of contrary belief. which is thoroughly represented in the article, given a fair shake, something that orthodox Shakespeareans find almost impossible to do. So having just cited O.J. Campbell, for example, and Samuel Schoenbaum on the same point, both of whom proclaimed that the same fact proved clearly that the fact that they're listed together in the same list proved that Mears thought of Shakespeare and Oxford as two separate persons. I was bemused not only by the derivative character, the entirely derivative character of Professor Shapiro's confidence, but also by Shapiro's comically authoritarian conversion of the word clearly to crushingly. And I wrote as follows: James Shapiro, proceeding from clearly to crushingly in one giant leap for the Shakespeare industrial complex, credits Mears as a vital witness to the traditional view of the authorship of the plays, almost as if they were rebuilding New Place on the foundations made so conspicuous by Hallowell Phillips. What I did not point out, perhaps as incisively as I might have in the article, is to emphasize that the essential role that this Stratfordian testimony plays in evaluating the credibility of the solution that Dedabel and Legan and I after them have proposed. All these Shakespeare scholars recognized the doubling of names on Mears's list. They failed to consider or answer one critical question. Is it possible that Mears put both names on the same list because he wanted to make a point about them? My point is that I did not ignore the Stratfordian quote unquote consensus on this issue. Instead, I converted it to an asset on the way to uncover the larger design in the book, which confirmed Dedabel and Legan's solution to Mears's message. So this is just a brief interlude. These books have already been mentioned by Earl. I just want to encourage you to take a look at them. These are some of the books that Lucinda Falk and I have produced. She, as the designer, and has done a really terrific job of turning these books into something that I hope that we can all be proud of. So I was going to say a little bit more about them, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. So now I'm going to talk about Three Cheers for Standards, specifically in light of the issue of handwriting, which will lead into the second topic that I want to cover for you. So forensic document analysts have to testify in court. And in court, they can be cross-examined by lawyers advised by other experts. And therefore, what I have discovered in working over the years with several board-certified forensic document analysts is that they are extremely careful about how they draw conclusions. The results of that are that in practice, forensic handwriting analysts trained as practitioners make only 1/6 as many errors as the average layman. That's why their testimony is considered to be scientific and valid by the courts. So only on account of this do they have standing under federal law to offer expert testimony. No inquiry that ignores or belittles the testimony of such experts is likely to endure very long or provide credible solutions to our questions. If the experts are wrong, they can only be shown to be wrong by carefully following their own reasoning and utilizing their knowledge as well as understanding their biases. In short, to convince an expert, you must become one. So let's flash back to 2019. This is Shelley and I standing next to Mark Twain at the Mark Twain House at the conference that was held that year in Hartford, Connecticut. And Jan Scheffer, is Jan here? Jan came up to me at that conference, took me by the elbow and said, have you seen this 2016 book by John Casson and William Rubinstein, Sir Henry Neville with Shakespeare? No, I had not. He informed me that the book contained photographs of several books from the great house at Audley End in Essex, and that the claim of the book was that the annotations in question were made by Sir Henry Neville. And it is quite true from that book that one may conclude that at least some of these annotations are not in some sort of superficial way, but are intimately connected to at least two Shakespeare plays. In April 2022, I delivered a lecture for the Shakespeare Authorship Trust online, which you can find on YouTube, that disproved forensically the theory that Sir Henry Neville was the annotator. I did not, in that talk, make any positive argument about who the annotator was. I had not seen the books in question myself, and no forensic document analyst would ever draw a positive conclusion without first examining as much as possible the originals. So this is Audley End. And in June 2023, my wife, Shelley Maycock, and I made a second visit there. The first one was about a year earlier, supported by the de Vere Society grant program. We examined 14 books for evidence of Edward de Vere's annotations. 6 of them contain significant annotations that I am prepared to argue are his. The library at Audley End contains just over 100 pre-1605 books. There are 3 annotators at least in these books. The other 2 annotators are thought to be Sir Henry Saville and Sir Henry Neville, whose library they came through. Now, Neville died in 1612, so just keep that in mind when we consider how these books annotated by de Vere might have found their way into Neville's library. So, just to briefly cover a few of the books that are of interest. There is a Roman history by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, which has approximately 52 de Vere annotations in it. There is a copy of the 1574 edition of Tacitus, which has more like 600. And there is a copy of Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, which unfortunately is annotated only in the first pages by our annotator. The most interesting, however, is what you're looking at here. This is the spine on a volume that combines 2 different Greek histories of Rome, one by Appian and one by Cassius Dio. It was mistakenly reported by Caston and Rubinstein to contain a Dionysius section of Appian. And I should acknowledge to you that when I wrote the article that appeared both in the de Vere Society newsletter and later in our newsletter, that I was not fully clear on what we were looking at, because these books are bound in a volume that now says Works of Appian. But the annotations of interest to us are in the second half of the book with a separate title page that is Cassius Dio's History of Rome. And that contains about 1,000 of these annotations. So I'm going to show you about 4 or 5 of them here. I think you will recognize immediately why these annotations are important for us and indeed constitute a remarkable addition to our body of knowledge about Shakespeare, about Edward de Vere, and about the imaginative and compositional practices that led to these plays. The first one refers to the Battle of Actium between Caesar and Antony, which you will recall the entire series of scenes in Act 3 between scene 8 and 13 is the topic of the play. A few pages later, we get this. Cleopatra, enclosing herself in her monument, feigns death. Hearing of this, Mark Antony commits suicide. Well, Mark Antony in the play and in the annotations dies in the breast of Cleopatra, after being lifted up in a tragicomic scene to her monument, half dead, but still somewhat alive. The Shakespeare's point is that Mark Antony screws up his own suicide, unlike Cleopatra. That's part of the tragicomedy here. And finally, In the same book is this note: Cleopatra, fearing lest she be led in triumph at Rome, commits suicide. Now, these are just a few outtakes. I could easily talk to you for 2 hours or more about all of the annotations in this book in particular that are resonant with Shakespearean ideas. And let me just, this is the manuscript that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. Let me just read a little slice of this. So the themes and motifs featured in these annotations include topics as diverse as speeches. Many speeches of the historical characters in the narrative are noted. Wars and battles, marriages, deaths, legal and religious traditions of Rome, prophecies and dreams, political corruption, conflicts of monarchs and senators, suicides, the role of the people, the plebs in Roman history, international correspondence and messengers, including the punishment of messengers, which features so prominently in Antony and Cleopatra, suicides, international correspondence and messengers, encrypted messages, conspiracies, conflicts of monarchs and senators, tyranny, character, kingship, shipwreck, ambition, assassination, theories of comedy. Ooh, theories of comedy. How many people were taking notes on those, on that? And theatrical history. At least 3 major theaters are annotated in here, and the burning of the library at Alexandria as well, and much more of interest. So let's talk a little bit more about handwriting. Here are 6 principles that handwriting analysts use. The first one is understand the fundamentals, and I'll show you in a little bit later what that means. Collect a representative sample of both known and unknown hands, one that includes both the best and the worst evidence for either outcome. You collect the worst because you need to know what that is before you get cross-examined on the witness stand. Identify patterns in the primary evidence. Sample the larger population, and by larger population, I mean the population of writers of handwriting in the 16th century in England. Identify discriminating characteristics, which are those characteristics that allow one to argue that your samples are the same or different. Without specification, words like the same or different are meaningless in forensic handwriting. And finally, forensic analysts state their conclusions in degrees of confidence. So what are the fundamentals? I already told you the first bullet point here, that the forensic document experts prepare to be cross-examined. And here's my question to you: how might this influence the ways they go about constructing a methodology? So here are 2 quotations that will help us to fill in what is meant by fundamentals. First, the task of drawing conclusions from data about other data is a matter of statistical inference. Statistical inference, that is, statistical proof, underlies all scientific investigations in some manner. And to be a scientific pursuit, the identification of handwriting must knowingly or unknowingly engage statistical proof. I already told you I'm terrified of math. I am not a statistician. I don't do that. But what anyone can do is apply the fundamentals of statistics, which refers to the concept of selecting multiple representative pieces of the handwriting to make sure that one is not led by confirmation bias and is not merely cherry picking the elements that support one's own preferred outcome. Secondly, writings which follow the same general style must inevitably show certain similarities. After all, there are so many letters in the alphabet. And if similarities alone are searched for, as is often the case, an erroneous conclusion is not only possible, it is probable. So collect a representative sample I didn't quite finish this slide. I apologize. This presentation is a little bit less finished than I wish it was. But I personally have about 30 complete documents of de Vere's handwriting in electronic facsimile. I have another 300 or so samples of early modern italic hands from England that Shelley and I were able to collect on the same trip from the British Museum. So I have a lot of data to draw from. So I want to give you one example here, one specific example. So what I'm showing you here are three what we call exemplars. An exemplar is an individual letter or sometimes a group of letters that are extracted from a larger sample for the purposes of comparison. This is how de Vere makes the long S in a word. And I'm going to show you two possible comparisons to this, and I'm going to ask you what you think about them. So this is the Audley End unknown hand. Now you may be seeing a lot of similarities here. I'm also going to ask you if anyone can see some differences here, because I can see some differences, but I can also tell you why there are differences. And then here is unknown number two. So forensic document analysts never draw a conclusion from only one letter, but sometimes only one letter can tell you a whole lot. It can point you in a certain direction, and then you have to test the hypothesis of difference or similarity. So which of these two, unknown number one or unknown number two, looks more like de Vere? Okay, why? Yes, not as embellished. And in fact, what you are referring to as embellishment is what I would call a cursive long S. Note that in both the de Vere letters and in unknown number one, the pen leaves the page after completing at the bottom, the hook on the bottom of the letter. Whereas in unknown number two, the pen does not leave the page. It makes a cursive loop and runs right into the next letter. So unknown number one, of course, is the Audley End annotator, and unknown number two is George Peele. In the article that I'm about to publish, the comparison is made with Neville, not with Peele. But we always have to sample a larger set of data, because until we've done that, until we're comparing three things or three samples at a minimum, we don't really know what's going on. As James V.P. Conway, a classic author in forensic studies, has put it, a series of fundamental agreements in identifying individualities is requisite to the conclusion that two writings were authored by the same person. In other words, he's stating what I just told you. We can't draw any definitive conclusion from this. But he goes on to say, and this is a truism in forensic handwriting studies, a single fundamental difference in an identifying individuality between the two writings precludes the conclusion that they were executed by the same person. Now, again, one can argue whether or not this is sufficient, but under that standard, it might very well be. So what I've done in this article that is forthcoming shortly from a major forensics journal that I will not name yet, but it should be out by early 2024, is to develop 9 standards, first showing that Sir Henry Neville is not the annotator, and then showing that Edward de Vere is. One of those is whole word comparison. In comparing these two very similar words, familiae, which is Latin, and familiaritas, which is a very Latinate English word, spelled kind of like a Latin word. Notice, for example, so notice the I's and the L. Notice the exact same angle in that word. Yeah. That is a strong indication. Again, not sufficient in itself, but it's a strong indication, along with the other similarities that we see here, that we're probably dealing with the same writer. There are some differences I mentioned. One of the differences is that the Audley End annotations are consistently written with a pen with a wider nib than the one de Vere uses in his correspondence. Another fascinating difference is the slant. Notice that the de Vere letter from his correspondence is at approximately 60 degrees, whereas the Audley End unknown is quite a bit more upright. It's about 80 degrees. But isn't this interesting? We now have control from the Edward de Vere Geneva Bible, and that is about 85 degrees. The conclusion I draw in my paper is that at least for the case of Edward de Vere, writing in the margins of books is more upright than writing on a complete sheet of paper. And I would say that plus the factor of the wider pen nib together will explain about 95% of what anyone could argue is a suggestion that these annotations are not by de Vere. And I developed that idea in the paper. So this is just our guy writing. This is obviously Hollywood's imagination. And that's the first page of the manuscript that I have before me here that will be published shortly. And in the interest of time, I will not read the rest of my comment here, but it's about, that comment was about the history that I bring to this inquiry. I've been interested in handwriting, forensic handwriting analysis since about 1991. And my first attempts, I look back on now with better judgment. And I was very fortunate to have really good mentors. Those included Mark Schell, Professor Mark Schell, who is now at Harvard, Professor William Mabius, who is at the University of Massachusetts and served there as the chair of the comparative literature department for many years, and also Ruth Lloyd Miller. And Mark Schell and Ruth Lloyd Miller both corrected my eager hopes that I had discovered a document in Edward de Vere's handwriting. And as a result of their correction, I became much better at this. And now I am good enough at it and fortunate to have the connections within the forensic community to be able to publish this document shortly, which will establish with a high degree of confidence. It's not a yes or no thing. It's a high degree of confidence that these annotations are by Edward de Vere. And maybe I will just close here because I do hope we have some time for questions. Let me just read for you the conclusion of my paper. This, by the way, is 18,000 words long. I anticipated a problem with that. I have had some useful feedback and review, but this journal is going to publish the whole thing. This is my conclusion. This study has tested a single, simple, and consequential proposition about the past. In the more than 14 volumes that Shelley Maycock and I have examined at Audley End, Sir Henry Neville's handwriting appears in only one, the Thucydides volume. Neville's handwriting, moreover, is quite distinct, and I have cross-reference to the figures in the paper that show that, from that of the Audley End unknown annotator. Both historical and forensic evidence instead confirm that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, is a highly probable writer of these annotations. The implications of such a finding fall outside the scope of a focused forensic inquiry. Now, I would be glad to hear questions, challenges, whatever's on your mind.
Wow. I have one question, Roger. The text of the volume you were examining was in Greek.
Correct.
The annotations are in Latin.
The annotations are about 90% in Latin and 9% in Greek. And there are annotations that I can show you where a Latin sentence has been completed with a word in Greek. When he needed the Greek word because it was more expressive of whatever he's trying to put down, he could switch to Greek. There is also one annotation in all of these in the English language. And this refers to the assassination of Julius Caesar, next to which has been written without any trial. Without any trial.
Provenance. How can that will be the important additional component to this? Can you address provenance?
Yes, thank you. The error, the major error that the advocates of Neville made in this case was to assume that because these books apparently did come through Neville's library to Audley End in approximately 1920, when the place where they were, which was a Billingsbury in Berkshire, had fallen into disrepair and shortly thereafter suffered a fire. So the books were moved to Audley End to protect them. There are various possible scenarios. Advocates of other possible authors, including the Northians and also the Nevillians, like to tell us that their guy in Oxford had nothing in common and were in different court factions. That is simply not correct. According to my understanding, Neville served 2 years in jail for the Essex Rebellion. Sable, whose annotations are also in these books, was a close friend of Neville's, and he was the intellectual advisor to Essex. One possible way in which these books found their way into Neville's possession was that they may have been loaned to Neville and Southampton when they were in the Tower. The character of the books would support that possibility. It's also possible that when Oxford died in 1604, Neville purchased or was given these books because he was an intellectual, he was a diplomat, he was fluent in French. It's interesting, he's not that fluent as a writer of Greek. There is one annotation in Neville's handwriting in this book and in the Thucydides volume, and it kind of looks like a child's writing. The guy, the Audley End unknown writer, whoever he was, is completely fluent in Greek. He is so fluent that he can correct errors in a Greek text printed by the printer to the Crown of France. You know, the best printer of these texts in the 16th century. I don't know if that answer is sufficient. I wish we had a better answer for it. But what I would add is simply this. Not knowing the provenance is not an argument against the forensics. The handwriting can stand on its own, even if we do not know exactly what was the route of the books, from Oxford to Audley End.
Tell them the possible year of publication of that text.
Yes, so the 3 Greek volumes are both large folios. I didn't mention this. They have 2-inch margins. These are books that are made for annotations, that they're specifically made for that. And they range between 1548 and I think 1553. They're all from that period approximately.
Thank you so much, Roger.